Every purchase we make has a carbon footprint, whether good or bad, and every time we buy something, we tell companies what we want them to continue to make. We also inform their competitors about what's important to us. Based on this, Sanchali Pal started Commons, an app that tracks the carbon emissions of all of our purchases. It's designed for you to learn about how your spending habits affect the environment, and it also suggests ways for you to reduce your impact. Extremely simple to use, the Commons app is a great way to begin learning about your impact on the environment. Check out this episode to learn about how your shopping habits impact the world we live in. Hey, Sanchali, thanks so much for joining us on the Sustainability Champions podcast. Great to have you on the show.
Daniel, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Of course. So the way I like to start these conversations is by taking a step back and getting a bigger picture view of what it is that you do and what it is that Commons does. So best way to do it is in a little elevator pitch, something just to introduce the work that you're doing. So what exactly is Commons?
Commons is an app that helps people make more sustainable spending choices. So, for instance, you can connect your spending data, your credit or debit card, and see the emissions of everything you buy. And then you can track, reduce, and offset those emissions easily as well. I built the product because I wanted to know how to make more sustainable lifestyle choices, and I found it incredibly difficult to know which choices actually mattered. So I wanted data behind it, and it turns out the way we spend money is the best predictor of our impact on the planet. And having a really simple, easy feed into being able to track, reduce, and offset those emissions is one of the fastest and most effective ways we as individuals can take climate action.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the economics of capitalism, I suppose, are a lot of people I hear talking about the challenges associated with capitalism, and we need to change the entire economic model in order to solve climate change and a lot of other societal woes, et cetera. I think perhaps that's an idealistic way of looking at it because that's a huge overhaul and these things don't happen overnight. So it sounds to me like you're basically using what we have in place now, which is capitalism, and doing the best you can to just shift the way things are working. So before we go into the solution, I'm curious to know what exactly are the challenges associated or what are the problems, environmental problems that are being created as a result of spending habits?
And just diving right into capitalism, I love it. But yeah, basically, I mean, the truth is we all spend money every day, and very few people don't.
Right.
There's some people maybe in certain corners of the earth who are still living entirely off the land and through
Mm-hmm.
barter economies. But most people in the modern world are using some form of money in order to um, create their lifestyles on earth. And that means we have to buy food, we have to buy housing, we have to buy transportation, we buy stuff, we buy clothes, we buy things we need in our daily lives. And we even have financial accounts, some of us. And so all of those things require energy and resources to produce, whether it's your genes that 80% of the carbon impact of those genes might be from the production itself, might be from the cloth and the water that goes into the manufacturing and the energy required, then it gets shipped to you. And then you also have usage emissions over time as you wash those clothes that probably registers in the form of your utility bill. So all of us are buying things every day to support our lifestyles, and all of those things have embedded carbon. Some of that is more obvious than others. Like, for instance, when we go to the gas pump and pump gas in our cars, we're literally using fossil fuels and then burning it, and we can see it happening. But there's many other ways that that same thing is happening. We're using fossil fuels and then burning it, but we just don't see it. It could be clothing, it could be food. There's many parts of our lives where it's more indirect, our connection to those fossil fuels. So the reality that we're dealing with is that we're in a society that's fueled by fossil fuels, and money is the currency in which we buy things that are produced using those fossil fuels as the core resources underlying the economy. And we as consumers are largely takers in that economy. We influence about 60% of global emissions through our spending choices. So household spending influences over 60% of global emissions. And that is surprising. I mean, it was surprising to me. surprising to many people, because we think of the people who have power over global emissions are like, country governments or companies who control large amounts of resources at once. And that is absolutely true. Those players do have a lot of power and responsibility to use their resources more responsibly. But also, we as consumers, when we think of ourselves as a collective, we have a lot more power as well. And the power that we have is to shift our demand, shift the way we want to use resources, shift that 60% of the economy that we have influence over through our spending choices. And that creates a huge opportunity because if you spend money, you're making a climate choice. Often, the average person in the US is making a climate choice 2 to 3 times a day in their spending choices. And if we can help people tap into those choices as opportunities to shift towards a more sustainable way of living, and we can help millions of people do that together, that can be a very quick way to have wide-reaching impact.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm actually really surprised by that 60% number. For some reason, that is really a lot higher than I expected. I know, although I'm not sure how accurate this number is, but I believe that, like 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions are somehow related to buildings, whether it's
Mm.
cement, steel, heating and cooling and all of that. So to hear that 60% is household spending, it actually makes sense because if you start, that's kind of a different graph, because a portion of all of that building related stuff is household spending. But that also actually, I think, is really good news that 60% of household, 60% is related to emissions, like based on what I do on a daily basis. That I find that to be actually very empowering because it means that my choices actually do make a difference. I've seen plenty of people on Instagram saying that it doesn't matter what we as individuals do, the corporations are the ones who need to change, or governments need to make big changes. And yes, of course, those things will help, but based on this, actually, the bulk of it is you and I making changes like switching light bulbs, investing in sealing up our windows so that cold air doesn't get in the winter, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
That's really where the power of change is.
Yeah, I think it is super interesting because there are many different narratives out there over um, who has power and who has responsibility to change our trajectory. And the truth is, all it's not either or.
Mm.
It's not like companies are the only ones who have power or governments are the only ones who have power. Governments regulate industries where companies play and sell products to consumers. And if consumers don't buy their products, there are no companies. Companies fail because people shift their tastes and preferences. And on the other hand, consumers also power the rise of new industries. For instance, plant-based protein is a great example where we didn't have a plant-based protein industry. It wasn't created because the government said there should be a plant-based protein industry, although they certainly played a role with some early stage research, and funding that research is always helpful. And they need to approve new proteins to get to market. So there's definitely a role for government to play. But ultimately, it was driven by consumers' demand. Americans wanted to eat less red meat largely for health reasons, and we're looking for alternatives to red meat. But then also there was lots of other reasons, like sustainability being one of them. And then companies introduce these products to serve their customers. And that is an example, I think, of the power of consumers in shifting markets and ultimately shifting the makeup of our global emissions. It's not that it's only government or only companies or only consumers. It's certainly all of us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One thing I've always said, and I think what you're talking about sort of really fits nicely into this, is I personally believe that if capitalism got us into this mess, then capitalism can easily, okay, maybe easily is an overstatement, but capitalism can be the vehicle that gets us out of it, simply because of what you just said, which is with enough consumer demand, companies are shifting, and everything shifts, because even certainly in the US, I mean, politics are based on consumer demand. It's voting. So we as individuals have the power. We just need to exercise that right, and privilege, and take sort of responsibility for how we use our money, how we vote with our wallet or vote with our ballot, and then change starts to happen. I think perhaps what where people's frustration comes from is that it's a slow process. And with emission targets and trying to hit net zero by 2030, sort of letting the natural cycle of politics play itself out is a little too slow. But at the same time, it does work. It just takes time. But I guess that's kind of where your app steps in, because it allows people to make choices faster and more effectively, which does shift that demand. So if we start breaking down the app a little bit more, Commons, how exactly does it work, and what happens when you first download the app?
Yeah, so you can go download Commons from the App Store or the Android Play Store. It's available on iOS and Android in the US and Canada. Once you find the app and download it, you'll be able to decide how you want to start your climate journey. Do you want to start with tracking your carbon footprint and getting data about where your emissions come from? Do you want to start with building sustainable lifestyle choices, decarbonizing different parts of your life? Or do you want to start with offsetting your footprint as a first step? No judgment. Everyone wants to start with something different. Some people like me want to get into the data first before they decide what action they want to take. Other people, they may already feel like they have a pretty good sense of where their footprint comes from and they want to get ready with taking action. Or they might even want to connect with other people. There's a community element to the app too, where you can follow others and see what kinds of action they're taking. Or you might decide, actually, I've been thinking about offsets for a while, but they're not super high quality, or I hear
Mm,
there's concerns about them. That
mhm.
was how I was approaching offsets as a consumer as well, was, what exactly are these magical offsets that can erase my emissions? Do they
Yeah.
really work? Um, the answer is most of them don't, and they're not a magic eraser ever. But what they can do is help express demand for the emissions that you can't avoid yourself to be reduced or removed by promising climate solutions around the world. And what Commons does in that case is does the evaluation work for you so that you can curate the best portfolio of carbon offsets available. You can have access to the same quality of offsets that high quality corporate buyers get because we're aggregating our demand. So in all of these cases, we're joining a community. The app allows you to connect your credit or debit card if you would like to, and for free, track the emissions of everything you buy. Um, or offset your emissions. You can offset just a flight if you'd like, or you can subscribe to offset your entire footprint, which is what I do because I'd like to just be a climate neutral person. And I'm continuously working to reduce my footprint. But because our society is based on fossil fuels, there will never be a time when I have a zero footprint lifestyle until we fully shift off of, maybe not even if we fully shift off of fossil fuels. Um, so that subscription is proportional to my emissions every month. If I emit less, I pay less. If I emit more, I pay more. It's kind of
Mhm.
like a carbon tax. Um, and the app will also offer content. So, for instance, something I'm working on right now is eating more seasonal and local. It's summertime, there's lots of amazing fruits and vegetables available in California. We're releasing a new app feature that helps you see the carbon impact and community impact of eating more seasonal and local. Spoiler, it's much lower impact than many of the other actions in the app, but it is something that has many other benefits besides carbon. And so you can discover that other content and continue to learn about building a sustainable life with others.
Fantastic. One question that I'm very curious to know about in terms of tracking the emissions. So I love this idea of connecting my credit card to the app, and then sort of the app just magically knowing how much each of my purchases, how many emissions are generated by the purchase. How do you get that data?
So we combine a bunch of different data sets that include national, local, and user level data to estimate the emissions of your purchases. I'll give you an example because that's usually easiest. With something like gasoline, we can get really accurate. So we can say you spent $50 on gasoline today in Oakland, California. The price of gasoline was $5 a gallon in Oakland today. So you probably bought 10 gallons of gasoline. The EPA's national data set says the average combustion factor of a gallon of gasoline gives you a certain kgs of CO2 per gallon. And then we'll multiply that out and tell you, okay, the carbon impact of your gasoline purchase was 20 kgs of CO2 or something like that. So for gasoline, we're getting really specific. We're saying for you in Oakland, how many gallons of gasoline did you buy? What was the emissions of those gallons?
Wow.
For and we can do really accurate type of calculations for things like gasoline utilities, where there's clearly one thing you're purchasing and the emissions factor is very well known. It starts to get a little fuzzy with stuff like food. Our goal is to help people get a carbon intuition or a relative understanding of the emissions of their different choices, so that they can make more sustainable choices on average. So we're not trying to get perfectly granular, and we're trying to avoid as much user pain as possible, making it no manual input required. So for something like food, we might ask you in general, how much meat do you eat? I would say I eat meat 1 meal a week. That's my personal practice. And so if I spend $100 at Whole Foods, I'll have a lower carbon footprint per dollar than someone who eats meat every day. You won't know exactly what was in my basket, but you will know that on average, the most important information is how much meat I eat, what kinds of meat I eat, and then how much money I spent on groceries.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's some things that are really challenging, like you spent $100 at Amazon. We have maybe no idea what you bought. We can get a little bit more specific. So there's certain places where we're prompting users for more information if they would like. But what we do know is over like 3 or 4 purchases at Amazon, on average, you'll be able to see, this month, how much was my carbon footprint from Amazon versus my groceries versus my clothing purchases.
Mhm.
That on average, it helps you get a relative sense of the importance of those choices. Um, so that's a bit of the details of how that works.
Yeah, and I like what you said about getting kind of carbon intuition rather than actual 100% accurate carbon data, because to your point, it's practically impossible without user pain. You know, the only way to really get very accurate data, I would imagine, is if the user tracks meticulously every single thing, where it's being shipped from, where they live, et cetera, et cetera. Are they doing expedited, or because Amazon offers, like you can
Mm-hmm.
bundle all of your stuff on one shipping day. It's just too much information. No one's going to use it. But if you get an idea that every time you shop at Amazon, it's X number of kilograms, and instead, if you actually go to the store and buy the same thing, it's lower, then that gives you at least an idea that if possible, I should go to the store, even if it means I'm driving.
Yeah.
Um, and I suppose that's exactly how you start to get that intuition, by really tracking the emissions of your spending, and just you get a baseline, and then you start noticing how you fluctuate. I'm curious to know, how, first of all, when was how much data do you have in terms of user spending? Like, for how long have you been tracking what people are doing?
Well, we launched the app first in 2020.
Okay.
So in sort of mid 2020, we launched the first version of the app. We do have users who joined then and are still on the app now. Of course, most of our growth has been more recent as we've started to promote the app more in the last year or so. But when someone joins, if you do choose to connect your credit card data, we get at least 3 months of data from before you joined, so that we can help you compare to before when you started. And for some banks and some folks, that can go back as much as a year or two as well.
Oh, wow.
So actually, from the first day that you join, you can get pretty robust data, looking backwards to see how has my carbon footprint fluctuated over time already, just on day one in the app, and then what are some examples or recommendations of actions that would be highest impact for someone of my lifestyle going forward.
Yeah, and I'm curious to know, I mean, as people start to use the app, considering that you have historical data, and then the moment people actually start using it, do you see on average a trajectory of emissions going down as usage of the app increases?
We do. And we can especially track this for folks, because folks who have connected their spending, we can look at their spending before they join the app and afterwards. So for 2022, we did our impact report at the end of the year. Um, and we found that on average, people who connect their cards and track their carbon footprint are lowering their emissions by about 20% a year, which is
Wow.
huge and
Yeah, that's
really,
very
really
substantial.
impressive. Um, it's great. And it actually aligns with a lot of the academic research in this space, which says that on average, giving people feedback about their carbon footprint will help them reduce emissions between 15 and 25%.
Hmm.
So it actually really strongly aligns with the observed data from the lab as well. Um, and most of that is a combined metric for offsetting and reduction. So about half of that is coming from offsetting, and about half of it is coming from reduction. We have some folks who decide to offset their full footprint, but it's a small proportion of the total folks on the app And then many people who connect their cards actually do start to lower their emissions in various ways, just through behavior change or spending changes.
Yeah, and so just to clarify, and you just said it, but just to make it clear, the difference between when you say half is offsetting, half is reduction, what you mean by that is 50% of that is people actually changing their behavior and actively reducing the amount of CO2 that they produce on a daily basis through purchases. And the other 50%, which is offsetting, is purchasing what are called carbon credits or carbon offsets and actually using those to, well, offset, I suppose, the emissions that you can't avoid. And so that's part of what the app does as well, as you mentioned at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
is people can offset. So what does it actually mean within the context of commons to offset emissions? How does that actually work, and what projects are you supporting, and yeah, et cetera?
So offsetting as a concept means that we're paying for carbon to be drawn down somewhere in the world, and we're paying to purchase those carbon credits to compensate for emissions we're releasing. And so for me as an individual, my carbon footprint last month was around 1.5 tons or 1,500 kgs of CO2. That was emissions that I could not avoid, even though I was paying attention to lowering my emissions, and that's totally fine. Like we were saying earlier, having a footprint is unavoidable living as a human in a capitalist society.
Right.
Um, so what I wanted to do is get to net zero right now, basically get to climate neutral right now. And so I paid for 1,500 kgs of CO2 credits, or 1.5 tons of carbon credits to offset those emissions. What Commons does is our team every quarter evaluates offset projects and curates a portfolio of those projects to sell to our customers. The average price of that is about $25 a ton. Um, and so why a portfolio? Because offsets are not perfect. It's kind of like a stock. It's like you're taking a bet on a future return. And so when you buy into an offset project, you're saying, I really hope this offset project will reduce or remove this much carbon. And there's a pretty good chance it will, but there's also a chance it won't. So every offset project, whether it's a forestry project or a seaweed project in the ocean or direct air capture, has risks associated with it. Maybe those trees were affected by a wildfire or infested with termites, or maybe the direct air capture project startup didn't get their second round of funding. So there's different types of risk: technology risk, natural risk. And you want, when you're trying to maximize your return, you want to diversify your risks in your portfolio. So we take the same approach as we would take in a financial portfolio with an offset portfolio, where we research offset projects on behalf of our customers. We find ones that have highest likelihood of a return within their category. So we evaluate a bunch of different forestry projects. We find the ones that have the longest durability, that are most additional, so they wouldn't have happened otherwise if someone hadn't paid for them to happen. They're not likely to displace, into logging to other places just by protecting these forests. So we look into all of those factors to find projects that are most likely to have the impact they say they are. And then we consult third-party standards, but we go far beyond them, because just getting a Vera or a gold standard certification isn't enough to know if a project is likely to have an impact. And then we curate this portfolio. So our portfolio right now includes forestry projects from Pachama, for instance. It also includes charm industrial credits that are long duration, bio oil credits that are actually taking agricultural waste, turning it into oil and injecting it back into the earth. We also have some ocean-based projects where we are investing in kelp farms in Maine with running tide. And so our portfolio has a diversified set of different projects that together we believe will maximize the impact of our customers' dollars.
That's awesome. And I like that a lot of your projects are related to nature in one way or another. Charm Industrials is pretty cool. I think they just got a big round, yeah, in the last week or so. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the bio oil is a really cool idea. But I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense in terms of the things you can't avoid. If you can support a project somewhere else that's doing good for the environment and ultimately for carbon, I mean, that's the point of an offset. It allows you to get to zero, even if you can't get to zero. And for if you don't want to only rely on offsetting, but you realize you actually have a substantial amount of carbon because you start working on, you plug all your stuff into the app and you realize, wow, I have a really big carbon footprint. Does Commons help give you ideas in terms of what you can do? I mean, you've already listed, or you've said that you eat meat once a week, so that's a big difference. Are there any other ideas in the app? And if I don't know where to start, but I want to do something?
Yes, definitely. I think this is one of the most important and also challenging parts of building this product is that if you think about it, there's like basically everything in your life has emissions associated with it, whether it's like your Netflix subscription or a haircut, or it's a clothing purchase, or it's your burger or your flight. Like all of those things have a carbon impact. And the point is, again, not perfection is like we have to live in the world and we have to enjoy it and we have to see the people we love. Otherwise, you know, what's worth living for anyway? Um, but we can do a lot of those things in a much lower impact way. And that's what a lot of our users have discovered in this process of lowering their emissions is that sometimes the things that actually lower our footprint are things that we're willing to do. Sometimes they're things that make us better off or save us money. So, for instance, one of the actions we recommend to folks is shopping more secondhand. Um, Shopping for secondhand furniture is specifically a new action that we released in the app. Um, Vintage furniture is really fun, beautiful, saves you money sometimes, and can be a really exciting way to express your individuality in your home. It also is much gentler on the planet. I was shocked to find out that the US produces 12 million new items of furniture a year, I believe, and puts 9 million, or maybe it's 12 million units of some kind, and it puts 9 million in the landfill every year. Um, and that's a huge part of what's in our landfill these days. So thinking about how can we buy less stuff? How can we buy things that will last longer? How do we keep in use things over time? That can be a really powerful way to have a lower carbon footprint and also to live in a way that's more aligned with your values or even just to have a nicer home that cost you less money. Um, so those are the kinds of actions we're trying to help suggest to people, things that are achievable and high impact. Um, for another one I mentioned was switching our utilities to green energy. A lot of people don't realize that you don't have to put solar panels on your roof to support clean energy. You can actually do that sometimes through your utility provider, through community solar. Um, and it depends on where you live. Some of it can be complex. So we help break that down based on where you live. We'll give you your recommendations of how you can go green with your electricity very quickly. Often it'll save you money as well. So the app does from the first time you download it in onboarding, we'll give you the first few recommendations. If you do connect your spending based on your spending history, we'll give you ideas of for someone like you, what are some of the highest impact actions you can take? And then over time, as you use it, you'll also start to get more tailored recommendations.
That's awesome. I think that's great because ultimately that's I think where people need the most help is now that I see where my spending is, how do I actually make those changes? What was the moment you realized that this was the work that you wanted to do?
I feel like this has taken me time to figure that out. I first There was a moment when I first decided I wanted to start carbon tracking, which
Mhm.
was when I was a senior in college, and I saw the documentary Food Inc. Um, I was an economics major, and I was also the manager in my dining hall, and I think that it just like hit me at the right time in my life, where I was like, oh yeah, I am a consumer and I spend money and I buy meat. And then I also complain about these, like, I don't want this industrial food system to be the way it is. Um, and now I see the link between consumer demand, why consumer demand is often fueling this type of food system without me realizing it. So, what if I decided to change? Would it matter? Was the question in my mind. And so I thought, I want to measure it. I want to know which doesn't do my choices matter. If I went vegetarian, would it matter? And if everyone did that, what would the world look like? So I just started by tracking my own emissions from food. I started tracking how many meals a week am I eating meat, red meat, white meat, dairy, and eggs. I found that I was actually eating meat a lot more than I thought. I was eating meat 12 meals a week on average because I was in the dining hall and I was just sort of like picking on my salad or whatever it's there for dinner, I'll eat it. And I was like, do I really need to eat meat 12 meals a week? Probably, I probably wouldn't notice if I cut it down a little bit. So I cut it down to six and then four and then two. And I was like, okay, two's kind of hard. Um, what if I kept it at two for the rest of my life? Like I didn't go fully vegetarian, but I ate meat 2 meals a week for the rest of my life. And I found that just that change would have taken half a car off the road from a carbon perspective every year. And I was like, oh, okay, that's meaningful. Like I'm totally willing to do that. If I'm taking half a car off the road every year and
Right.
I'm still eating meat 1 or 2 meals a week, um, that's like a no-brainer for sure. That impact is worth it to me. And then I cut down to one, and now for the last 10 years, I've been eating meat 1 meal a week.
Mm.
Um, and I always thought it had to be all or nothing. Like I thought it's like you either have to be vegetarian or not. Um, but the truth is, like, carbon is very mathematical. It doesn't matter if you do it like zero versus one doesn't really matter. Um, and so there was that kind of thinking, applying that then to many other parts of my life helped me make choices. Now I include carbon in my decision making. I don't always make the lowest carbon choice, but I always include it in my choices. So it's just like, if I'm trying to optimize for calories, I don't always have a salad, but I know that if I eat a burger, like I'm probably not going to eat a burger every meal. That would be terrible for me. And so yeah, I'm not going to fly every single time I think about taking a trip. I still fly, um, but I just do it less often than I would if I wasn't thinking about the carbon impact at all. And I do it differently. I treat it like a very precious thing when I
Mm.
fly. It's not just the dollar cost of it. I also consider the carbon cost. And that was something I was doing in my life for about 6 years before I had the idea that this might be a company. And I think really I started realizing it could be a company when I went to business school and I had to talk to people about these climate practices I had. And people kind of looked at me like, what? Like one day I said I was vegetarian and the next day I wasn't. And one day I said I would go on a flight and the next day for carbon reasons, I'm not going on the flight. And they were like, why? That doesn't make any sense. So I would explain my carbon practices. And then people got really curious about it. They were like, oh, that's interesting. I had a spreadsheet for my own emissions that I was using. And they were like, could you do that for me too? Like, what are the one or two things I could be doing that I didn't realize? Like the carbon ROI is higher than I would expect. Um, and so when I started talking to people about it, and that was like around 2017, 2018, people were starting to pay a lot more attention to climate. And the IPCC report came out in the end of 2018. And around then was when I was realizing like the momentum has totally changed. Like consumers care way more about this. There's a lot more consciousness about wanting to make more sustainable choices. And it's very possible that there could be a tool that's mainstream very soon for everyone to be able to make climate choices more easily. So that was when I was like, okay, maybe this is a company. And just like we've had apps for managing our fitness and our finances and our mindfulness, the next app is going to be climate.
Yeah, and that story makes a lot of sense, and I think it's pretty obvious how you got to this point. What I really like about it is the balanced approach of your, as you call them, carbon practices. I like that it's not all or nothing, because frequently all or nothing, just like a diet that is extremely strict, it's not sustainable. No pun intended, for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally believe that sustainability has to be sustainable. And what you're seeing in terms of the numbers is that, zero meals a week, or eating meat 0 times a week versus 1 time doesn't make such a big difference that, but from the point of view of whether or not you'll stick with it, it does make a very meaningful difference. Because if you're eating meat only once or twice a week, and you can actually maintain that for the rest of your life, but cutting it out completely, that's a whole nother story altogether. And that makes it much more challenging. So I
Yeah.
think yeah, that's a really important lesson. And I suppose having the app, and where you're able to track and see, I eat meat once a week, it doesn't really make that big of a difference over the long term from a carbon perspective. I think I mean, I've seen this quote or meme or whatever 1,000 times on Instagram where it says, we don't need one person doing sustainability perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly. That really speaks to that, because ultimately everyone doing a little bit adds up substantially more than one person being fanatical and not, you know, so it also
I
makes it
really
much
like
more,
that.
yeah, it makes it much more
Yeah.
approachable for anyone who sort of wants to do it but isn't that committed, but they know they should. So little changes along the way, it all adds up.
Yeah, totally. I think that really resonates. And it reminds me a little bit of like, I think what's also changed is from a research perspective, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has also started doing more research on demand side changes and how that's going to be a part of us getting to our net zero targets. And their report last year found that 40 to 70% of the emissions reductions we're going to make by 2050 are going to come from different lifestyles and behaviors. Now, many of that needs to be supported by infrastructure changes, by government policies, but ultimately, like, we're all going to be living differently in 20 years. And we can either make that happen as fast as possible, or we can get there kicking and streaming and screaming like accidentally, 50 years too late. Or we can get there, much faster in a way that we get to drive.
Absolutely. And as part of that, just a nice little dovetail to my next question in terms of what is next for you and the team at Commons to help get us to those goals of in 2050.
Really, what we're trying to figure out next is how do we get this tool into as many people's hands as possible? To your point, we need millions of people doing this imperfectly. Our product will have a huge impact if we can get many, many people to use it. And it will have a small impact if we can only have a few people use it. And so we're trying to think about the product is free to use. We're trying to figure out how do we get the word out there? How do we produce? How do we get our carbon estimates and guidance in front of as many people as possible through the app and outside it? So we're experimenting with also developing free content that people can use outside of the product if they're interested. Whether that's through social media or through our blog, our team is doing a bunch of research that's going into the app, and we can reveal as much of that as possible through other channels as well. Um, and we're also trying to figure out how do we guide people on how they actually do spend money. So we have, the tracking part of the app is quite robust. We're always trying to make it better, but it's pretty robust. The offsetting is pretty sort of set it and forget it. You can sign up and never really have to worry about it. We'll give you impact updates. We'll give you a sense of how your cost is changing over time. But there's not a lot of work required for the user. It's automated. What we do want to help people do is next time you have a spending choice, how do you make that spending choice more sustainably than you could without Commons? And so that's what we're working on, is providing more specific guidance, advice on which types of purchases or brands are more sustainable than others, acknowledging that we're all going to be spending money. Maybe we spend it less. We spend it on things that are not always new, and then we spend it at places that are actually trying to shift our carbon economy to be more sustainable.
Yeah, I think that's really important at this point. Yeah, the more people who get involved, the better it is ultimately. And like we're both just saying, we need as many people involved as humanly possible, because that's when changes are made. So, for anyone who's interested in learning more about you, about Commons, follow on social media, download the app, etc., what's the best way? Where do people go?
Yeah, definitely follow us at the Commons Earth on Instagram. You can go to our website as well, thecommons.earth. You can also explore all of our blogs and articles on there. We have a lot of great content on if you have a question about some aspect of your life and how to live more sustainably. There's probably a blog we've written about it. And then, of course, you can download the app on Android or iOS. So follow us there.
Excellent. Well, Sanchali, thank you so much for your time and really appreciate the work that you're doing. I think your approach is really pragmatic, and how you're doing it is focused on long-term change, by not making people or encouraging people to do anything radical. It ensures that people actually can dabble or go as far as they want, and as I said earlier, I think sustainability has to be sustainable or else people won't maintain it. And the way that you've done it with Commons in terms of it's very hands off, it's very simple from a user point of view. That's the kind of activity or that's the kind of thing that people want is sort of like you said, set it and forget it. And then you can check whenever you remember and see how you're progressing. And yeah, keep working on, cutting the carbon numbers down and offsetting if you'd like what's left over. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing how many people you can get on board in the coming years and continuing to make that impact.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And this was a great conversation.